an interview with 606, I believe is how you pronounce that. You stated, yeah, I'm like 606. You stated that racism is not the problem of extremists or the alt-right, that it's an American problem and that it's our problem, and that Christian organizations and individual Christians need to do some serious soul searching and be ready to face themselves and their history, really to pay attention to those voices and from other targets of racism and other forms of bigotry and ask themselves, what part do I play in this suffering? Which we think is a great place to begin for anyone starting their anti-racism journey. But before Christians, and specifically white Christians, can even get there, this idea of white ignorance that you touch on needs to be understood and dismantled. So can you tell us a little bit more about that concept and how religion reinforces it?
Yes, I think this, really comes off the last answer very
Yeah.
nicely because,
Hmm.
again, my consistent concern is not and has never really been, oh my gosh, look at these extremists. And as a matter of fact, I think the discourse of extremism needs to be revisited because very often that becomes a distancing mechanism. So
Hmm.
like how do we talk about the more complex relationships between average everyday sort of settler colonialist narratives that people walk around with and celebrate all the time and the kinds of extremist so-called extremist violence that happens in the context of these mass shootings where minorities are
Hmm.
targeted, whether that's in Atlanta or El Paso or in Pittsburgh or any of the number of cases that we could reference. And I think part of the problem is that the extremists offer an alibi for everybody else to act as if they're not implicated in this stuff. That somehow their rhetoric, their
Hmm.
speech, their dreams, the things that they think they should have, and the things that they're willing to do to get them are somehow not connected to the exact same kind of stated motive that a shooter would have. And of course, the actions are different, but the more complex relationships between racism as a necessary part of how the cultural imagination of many Americans has been constructed needs to be addressed, and the proximity between themselves and the so-called extremists needs to be discussed. And I think that's what we see, for example, in the Southern Baptist Convention, where you have their vote in 2017 during their convention, their annual convention, where they wanted to address, or at least some wanted to address, the alt-right and officially condemn it, and that didn't happen. That led to a big debate on the floor of the convention. They revisited the proposal to officially condemn the alt-right and finally passed it. But the damage had already been done because they what they did in that moment is sort of reminded not just the general public but the African American members of their community that they hadn't really adequately addressed their history rooted in slavery, rooted in support for segregation. And that continues to bedevil the convention as African American leaders keep leaving over the General Convention's inability to come to terms with Black Lives Matter, with critical race theory being included in theological training, and I think that's a symptom of the inability of Christian institutions, and especially white Christians, to come to terms with their own history and how embedded they actually are, and how invested they are in these racialized narratives.
Thank
So
you.
it's interesting. You just mentioned critical race theory being involved in religious trainings. At season one, when we were talking about educators and making sure that we're, training teachers to be able to understand, have cultural competence and be able to engage with our students across all different races. We talked about, is there training for that? Like, are they being taught, how to best educate all of our students? And so, is that something that you see happening? Like in religious training, are they starting to incorporate critical race theory in certain sects, or what do you see with that? What's happening with that?
That's absolutely happening. There are Christian organizations and Christian denominations or fellowships. There are individual Christians. There are pagans that are actively engaging in dismantling and confronting and dealing with racialist narratives and racist practices in their traditions. But when it comes to the kind of groups that I study, part of the thing that I've turned my attention to is the overlap with certain political concerns. And so I think, for example, Sojourner's Magazine is this very important evangelical magazine, but it comes from a politically progressive left point of view. So when they were dealing with the alt-right, they were already ahead of that discourse saying this is a continuation of things that have continued to be a problem in our society. Whereas for other Christian organizations like the Mormon Church, for example, or for the Southern Baptist Convention, it was more of like we need to have this moment where we take a certain position very publicly because we have to deal with this history that's still a part of how we engage with communities. So, it's very much situational. So, but there are, religious organizations and religious individuals in whole denominations that are trying very hard to incorporate better understanding of critical race theory to get at these pernicious problems.